Very good. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for day 2 of API Vote's National Leadership Summit. Thanks for sticking with us. We're in for a treat today. We'll be talking about education policy and more specifically, the 2020 policy platform of the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans. My name is Greg Orton, and I'm the National Director of the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, also known as AGAPA. Today we'll be joined by Congressman Mark Takano, as well as our 2 committee co-chairs of the education policy at AGAPA, to talk specifically about the education section of the platform. And so rather than spend a long time introducing everything, we're going to do our best to make education policy exciting. It's not that hard to do, so stick with us. And without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Congressman Mark Takano, who is the chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee in the House of Representatives. He's also the Education Task Force for the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. And Congressman Mark Takano joined in 2012 as the first openly gay member of color. And for me, as someone who worked in Congress during that time, I'm shocked that it's been that long, sir. I think you're a veteran now by all measures. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for your leadership and for your work. And I turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you, Greg Orton. Thank you, everyone at the Council on Asian Pacific Americans, for having me here at the 2020 Policy Platform briefing to discuss our education policy priorities. And I've been watching the participant numbers go from like 5, 6, all the way up to 54 people. It looks like it's increasing. So thank all of you for joining the call, joining this Zoom meeting. I'm really interested to find ways to creatively connect with each other during this pandemic and to keep having these important discussions in our community. We got to stay engaged with each other. And as Greg said, I was elected to Congress in 2012. I've been a public school teacher for 24 years prior to that. And I was also a community college trustee for more than 20 decades. So between K-12 education being my day job and my part-time role as a community college trustee, I have both kind of, K-12 experience and post-secondary experience in policymaking. And it has been 8 years, Greg, almost 8 years, 8.5 years. I look back and I think, God, it went by really fast. You just, every year, 2 years, you go through this election. It seems like 2 years is nothing, but then it's stacked up on top of each other. And now I chair a committee, which I kind of can't believe I'm doing that. And I'm in weekly meetings with Speaker Pelosi, and she calls me up at 10 o'clock. She's known for doing that, calls up members at late at night, because I don't know when she sleeps, but she's amazing. She introduced me as the first openly gay person of color, and she couldn't remember what I was, just between David Cicely being the first openly gay person who was a mayor of a city, she has to remember. I mean, I'm amazed she remembers all this stuff. And then she kind of hesitated, and I said, you can just say I'm a Gaysian, Madam, she was then Madam Leader. And then she just, because, in her place, you can't say the wrong thing. Otherwise it becomes like this major flap. So she said, it's about respect. It's about respect, she said to me. I said, yeah, I understand. And, you always have my respect, Madam Speaker. So I am a senior member on the Education and Labor Committee, and I'm proud to serve as vice chair of the Asian Pacific American Caucus. And that I have an intersectional role there that gives me an opportunity to advocate for AAPI students across the country, because I serve on the Committee of Jurisdiction, and I'm also a vice chair of KPAC. And I intend to ensure that AAPI students have access to quality education, to create safe and effective learning environments, and to hold those in power accountable on behalf of minority students. And we have a lot of work to do across the board to improve education outcomes for AAPI students. And one of the most relevant barriers to success continues to be the model minority myth. all of us on this call, I'm sure, have been dealing with this this myth, the misperception that inaccurately portrays the diverse AAPI population as homogenous and academically as a homogenous and academically successful unit. It's never been the case that that was true, and it's not true now. And it's just not that simple to say that just because you look Asian, you must be academically successful, you must be economically advantaged. Our community is very diverse, and we have many different immigrant groups within the AAPI bandwidth. The reality is that AAPI students face a range of diverse educational challenges, both in K-12 and higher education, and we have to address those challenges in order to properly serve the needs of these students. There is a jarring lack of culturally competent education, linguistically appropriate outreach, and all-around lack of access for these students. To fully support our AAPI students from K-12 and beyond, we need to support undocumented students' access to higher education, build and preserve the capacity of schools to serve AA and NHPI students, support English language learner students, and improve teacher preparation and diversity, and that's just a start. I know that NCAPA is an organization that generally is supportive of affirmative action. I have been all my life. I consider myself to be a beneficiary of affirmative action. And we do have newer immigrant groups within our community who don't know the history of why affirmative action applies to Asian Americans. And it's interesting right now that the COVID-19 pandemic has basically shut down SAT testing and achievement testing and advanced placement testing. And that is going to have an impact on college admissions, maybe for the better. I think maybe for the better. But it's also going to cause an adjustment for, I think, our community. And frankly, we do have to watch out for ways in which admissions procedures may put our students at a disadvantage. We have to make sure that students aren't looked at from the model minority myth, and that admissions committees and admissions processes are sensitive to that. One of the things I did like about Andrew Yang is that he was a full-throated supporter of affirmative action, and it was important for one of the more successful, or one of the more recent runs of an Asian American in presidential primary space that that candidate spoke in favor of affirmative action. Another tool to help AAPIs are known as NHPIs. Each year, I'm one of the members that leads the effort to the Labor, Health, and Human Services, Education, and Related Services Appropriations Subcommittee, otherwise known as LHHS, the LHHS Appropriations Subcommittee. I lead the effort. I help to lead the effort for strengthening Asian American and Native American Pacific Islanders Serving Institutions program, otherwise known as NHPI. Now, this is a critical minority serving institution program. It provides grants and other supports to build the capacity and effectiveness of institutions that serve many low-income AAPI students. It also provides culturally sensitive tutoring and counseling services, and provides retention and graduation and outreach strategies, and increases the reflection of AAPI history and culture in the classroom. We know that 40% of all AAPI students in the nation get served by this program, and 75% of all low-income AAPI students. That's a lot. 3/4 of all low-income AAPI students are helped by NHPIs. And it's so really important that we have NHPIs supported by our federal government. Now, it's important to know that it's important for Americans generally, and actually progressives generally, to understand that immigration and the issues that undocumented students face is not only a Hispanic and Latino issue. It's also an AAPI issue. And I have to give a lot of credit to KPAC Chair Judy Chu, because she has a nose for every important meeting that has been had on, say, the Dreamers. And Judy Chu has made sure that I show up. She's made sure that Ted Lieu shows up, and that Grace Meng shows up, that we all show. And you know, Pramila Jayapal is just an amazing leader on immigration issues. I mean, immigration is probably I think one of her great passions. Judy Chu too. I mean, to have these two, fierce advocates in Congress, we are very fortunate as a community to have them. And I don't think I'm as fierce as they are, but I'm as passionate as they are about Dreamers. I represent Dreamers in my community. I represent UCR, which is the most diverse UC campus, has a tremendous Dreamer population. It's probably as diverse as any campus that you'll find across our country. That's my district. That's what I represent. So we have to make sure that we have the back of our DACA recipients. Thankfully, the Supreme Court gave us more time with its DACA decision. And I so much appreciate that it ruled that the Trump administration did not have legal justification for dismantling the program. But we're not out of the woods yet, because it doesn't mean that the administration will leave DACA alone. We simply have bought more time for our Dreamers. America is home for our Dreamers. And there are Dreamers in colleges all across the country. And they are Dreamers that are working as healthcare workers. There are Dreamers that are first responders. I know there are Dreamers that are working in our schools as teachers. We have to support Dreamers in getting equality and their right to get an equality education. I also want to say that that you all probably know about the Plyler versus Doe decision in 1982, in which the Supreme Court ruled that undocumented children are protected by the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment, and they have the same right to a free public education as any other child. And as per the Plyler decision, no student can be denied educational services due to their immigration status. And schools cannot collect information related to immigration status, nor can they require that students provide their social security numbers to the school. I am committed to making sure that that decision is not diminished, and that we work on ways to strengthen it through legislation. I finally want to mention teacher preparation. As a former school teacher, I mentioned that in my opening. I'm a huge supporter of increasing funding in programs like the TEACH grant, which help to diversify our teaching workforce. Those low-income AAPIs in school, they should have open to them the option of being able to go in teaching. And if that's their fit, it shouldn't be that they're forced to go into something more lucrative than teaching. And so we want to support low-income AAPIs in going into teaching and in teaching where they're needed the most. And so the TEACH grants help that. It's not a grant, it's a loan. And it actually helps teachers as they're going through the training phase complete their teacher education. The House Democrats have included in the College Affordability Act a bill which reauthorizes the Higher Education Act, an increase in the grant to $8,000 per year. So we have a lot of work ahead of us, and it's going to require that we work with our allies and come together and fight for an education system that will give present and future generations the education they need and deserve. I will keep up the fight in Washington. I hope you'll join me in achieving our shared goals. It's up to us to improve outcomes for AAPI students and all students. We are in a very special moment. The marching in the streets in support of Black Lives Matter is something that I am very much in solidarity with. And I believe that the original sin of slavery, the history of racial discrimination in our country, is borne the heaviest by our African-American brothers and sisters. And, but, we also, I think, in our solidarity can also shine a light on what needs to be done for AAPIs as well. So we have a moment in which I think we really can turn our attention to making our country a more just country. And we won't be able to do that unless we improve educational opportunities for all people. I thank you for the work you're doing. I thank you for having me here today. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Congressman. And wow, that was amazing. I think certainly appreciate your constant leadership and your presence in Congress. But to all our viewers, both here in Zoom and on Facebook, enough cannot be said about the fact that we have a member of KPAC who not only has the ear of the Speaker of the House, but also clearly gets our issues. I mean, he just covered half of our platform, if not more. So thank you so much, Congressman. Before we get to our two committee chairs of the policy committee, a little bit of housekeeping. For those who are interested, you can post questions to our panelists in the Q&A or chat section on Zoom. I see that one person already has, an anonymous attendee. We'll love you however you show up. If you want to identify yourself, that's fine. But go ahead and send questions ahead of time, and we will, with time permitting, after we hear from our next speakers, try to answer some of those questions. So next, I'd like to now introduce Rita Pin-Ahrens, who is the Executive Director of OCA Asian Pacific American Advocates, and also who is one of the co-chairs of NCAPA's Education Committee. Rita, as we like to say, has been in the game for a minute, and she knows education policy quite well. And I know for a fact that if she wasn't here, a lot of our work wouldn't be possible. So Rita, I'll turn it now to you.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Greg. And I just want to also mention that I'm a former public school teacher. I taught 6th and 7th grade math, and this is why I did get into education policy, was because I did see a lot of the inequities firsthand in the two schools that I taught at. And so education is very near and dear to me. And I hope to continue working on behalf of the community for this. So my role now is to really tell you a little bit about the NCAPA Education Committee. So NCAPA Education Committee is composed of the following national organizations: the Council for Native Hawaiian Advancement, EPIC, which is Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, the Japanese American Citizens League, the Laotian American National Alliance, OCA, Asian Pacific American Advocates, and the Southeast Asian Resource Action Center, CIRAC. And with the input of the communities that we represent and work with across the country, we meet regularly as a committee to discuss education challenges facing our communities, and we provide policy priorities and recommendations at both the K-12 and higher education levels to really advance education equity and opportunities for our community members, focusing primarily on those who do have disparities, who are low income, who are first-generation immigrants and refugees like me. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my co-chair, Anna.
Thanks so much, Rita, and thank you, Greg, for your introduction, and also Congressman Takano for your introduction for this panel. My name is Anna Bian. I go by they, them pronouns, and I'm the Education Policy Manager at the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center, or CIRAC. I co-chair the Education Committee with Rita, and just to reiterate what Greg has said about Congressman Takano having covered most of our platform already. I do have Congressman Takano to thank for that, because I'm going to try to share my screen right now to provide all of you folks with the set of recommendations and policy priorities that we as a committee have drafted throughout 2019 in preparation for this critical 2020 year. It was a very collaborative effort between each of the member organizations of our committee, as well as working through the larger NCAPA coalition as well. And these were really the policy areas that we felt were critical to ensuring that all Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander students are supported in education, both from the K-12 level and beyond in higher education. And so I'm going to share my screen really quickly to let y'all folks see who can share. Only host. That's options. All right, thanks everyone for your patience. And again, so these are the 11 areas that we as a committee have chosen to look into. If you go onto the NCAPA website and open download the full lengthy 2020 policy platform, you can see a much more in-depth description of what we mean for each of these policy areas, as well as a set of recommendation under each of those policy priorities that we make for any incoming administration, as well as for Congress and other policymakers. And with that, I will kick it back to Greg.
Thank you so much, Anna and Rita. And so, one of the things we talked about when planning this panel is, NCAPA is a group of national API organizations, but all of our work should be grounded in what's happening on the ground. And so for this panel, we wanted to invite someone who works on the ground every day and someone who's also a member of NCAPA. And so our next speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce Anason Silivangse. I might have just committed the cardinal sin of a good moderator and mispronounced your name before. I apologize. But Anason is a teacher as well for over 2 decades. She's also a longtime board member of the Laotian American National Alliance, which is a member of NCAPA. And I know for a fact that Anason has been very active in the conversations we had internally when putting together this platform on the education section. So Anason, my pleasure now to turn it over to you. I think you're muted still. Anason, I think you're still good. Yep.
Oh, hold on. Let me see. Am I still muted?
You're good now.
Okay, I'm good now.
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Spidey. Thank you, Greg and Rita and Anna and Representative Takana for having me here on this panel. I'm extremely excited to be among other teachers. As Greg has said, I've been I'm going on my 25th or 26th year teaching in the public schools. So I definitely do have a firm grasp of what's going on, in education. So my main, priority here with the group is basically to answer questions about, what is it like, in the classroom, and then how can we help all of our students be successful. I'm also, a LANA board member as well.
Very good. Thank you, Anason. So from here, we had asked all of you to submit questions before you attended, and thankfully you did. And so we wanted, rather than to just talk at you for a long period of time, actually try to ground this in a real conversation. And so one of the first and probably most important questions for all of NCAPA's work is sort of, where do we find our values? And so I want to pose this question to all 3 of our speakers, but what are the values or at the core of the API education policy recommendations that you all help create? I'll turn it over to Rita to start us.
Sure, so I'm going to talk about our values of visibility and representation. These are 2 of the key values at the core of all of our recommendations for the Education Committee. I mean, first of all, we know that in the public school system, 5% of our students are AAPI, but only 2% are Asian American. And the numbers for NHPI educators are so low that they're rounded down to 0. And so having representation in the teaching force is important, as Representative Takano said. It would help us increase culturally relevant and sensitive curriculum. It would help ensure that we have people who look like us that we can really relate to and resonate with. Research has shown that students do so much better when they see teachers and school personnel that look like them. So in addition to this, we need to have the history and the contributions of AAPIs included in our schools, starting in kindergarten. So not waiting until college when you might take, a more dedicated stream of learning, but in kindergarten all the way through high school. So because we know that by excluding our history and our contributions, all students, not just our community members, all students are led to believe that we're perpetual foreigners, that we don't belong in this country. I mean, how many of us have heard, go back to your own country? Whether we're first generation, third generation, it doesn't matter. This is the perception we're facing all of the time. And also, there's this belief that we haven't contributed in meaningful ways to the American story because our stories simply aren't in the history books. So we need to change this by making sure that we're more visible, both in the teaching force and in our curriculum.
Anna, how about you?
Thank you so much for your question. And pardon me, let me just. Yeah, and so absolutely what Rita has said about visibility and representation, and I think two other values that really ground our platform is on equity as well as the safety of all students. And what we meant by equity is really truly in the sense of resources and funding. For example, the ANAPISI program, which is the federal program that provides funding for institutions to better support their Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander students, has been $5 million a year at maximum for mandatory funding since the program was first authorized in 2008. Current proposals going around in Congress have increased that number to 6 million, have proposed an increase to 6 million. But considering that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are they have the fastest rate of growth in the country for any racial and ethnic group, a slightly more increase is probably something that would be really helpful and critical to the success of thousands of AAPI students across the country who want to pursue higher education. So in funding, in higher education, certainly funding also in the K-12 space, just ensuring that all of our under-resourced schools actually do have the funding and the resources necessary for them to continue to successfully support students such as English language learners, as well as other low-income and marginalized students. In addition to the resources and funding aspect and equity in that sense, as a committee, we've also really wanted to espouse the value of safety of all students in our schools. Especially during this time of a lot of anti-Asian discrimination, harassment, and rhetoric coming from our country during this time of the coronavirus pandemic, it's absolutely critical that we continue to ensure that all of our students, all of our API students feel safe from bullying, from harassment, from hate, from racism in schools, that our children, and this is also in the context of the rollbacks of many civil rights protections, such as Title IX, such as other protections in the area of consumer protections for students who take out student loans. There was the rollback of healthcare protections for low income as well as transgender people in the healthcare space too, which has an impact on our students. And so we really wanted to make sure that we call on our policymakers to absolutely put the safety of all students first, including fostering positive school climates, as well as protecting immigrant and undocumented students as well, and ensuring that all children, no matter who they are, no matter where their background is from, that they have a right to an education in a safe, inclusive, and affirming space.
Thank you so much, Anna. And I'm going to switch it up a little bit with our next question, because you actually touched on it with the anti-Asian racism that we're seeing. And I'm going to pose this question to Anna-san, and then if the congressman is still with us, I'd love to get his perspective as well. But as many of you know, this panel and this whole town hall that this is leading up to was originally supposed to be in Las Vegas right now. And it's going to be this grand event with so many of us in place, thousands of us, hopefully. And obviously things have changed significantly. We're living through a time of COVID-19, and life has been fundamentally uprooted and changed. So Anasan, I'm curious, as an educator, what are some of the observations you've had as it relates to the challenges that have arisen for AAPI students or teachers of AAPI students now that we're living through COVID? And then next, I'll ask Congressman Takano to give his thoughts as well. Oh, Anasan, you got to unmute again.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that question. I think that's an extremely important question. As a teacher working, in the schools, I see these things. I see like my Vietnamese students walking by. I see my undocumented students also, dealing with all these, issues. And especially, you think about it. Imagine all this negative, news that you see and stereotypes of our Asian community. Imagine you like a teenager dealing with that. How would you feel going out in the community itself or, in the school? You have to wonder like, okay, are they going to think that, I'm responsible for this virus, or should I say something, So I think we have a history. Somebody said on the PBIS documentary that just came out on Asian American, and it stuck with me. It resonated with me. It said, to know yourself, you have to know your history, your roots, right? And so I think, during this time, we definitely have to empower our, students and let them know that, hey, look at us, we are here for you. We can, if you need help, we can be your sounding board, or just basically give them support. So I think that emotional support, and also bringing like their voices forward, being visible. I think, Rita had mentioned about, being, the visibility and being a voice for our community and also for our students. I think that's extremely important during this time, especially in the news. And I think what we have to also be, or should be able to do is highlight the positive, things, about our community, to say, look, we are still moving forward. And yes, it's been a challenge, but we can do this.
Great, thank you so much, Anasan. Now, Congressman, I know in Congress, it can be a lonely job fighting for our community when there's only 20 of you. Now, for those who don't know, 20 is actually a big number compared to where we were, even just a few short years ago. So, Congressman, from your perspective, what has the fight been like as far as now that we're in COVID-19 and the fight to sort of advocate for API students or immigrant families that are now struggling with the fact that we're sheltered in place and school no longer is school as we knew it?
Well, thank you for that question. The fight for immigrant families, has to do with, even though that people have legal access to this country, they're here on, they're documented. There are barriers to them getting healthcare, to being able to use, publicly funded healthcare, and we have legislation to fix that. We have, the big barriers for those, people have to realize that 10% of our DACA youth, and they're not children anymore. Many of them are like adults in their 20s and early 30s. That 10% of this population is API. So we have definitely a stake in the DACA issue. And I recall also the phrase, no history, no self. If you don't know your history, you don't know yourself. That I watched that on the documentary on the Cambodian diaspora in, I think, Long Beach, and how so much of the so many of the social issues that were confronted with that community was that the generation of young people was so, they were so separated from their history. They didn't know their history. I'm getting very emotional right now because I'm watching what African Americans are going through. And I just read a couple of very beautiful posts on Facebook by one of my classmates from Harvard, and he's African American, and he's got this amazing history that he knows is kind of unique among African Americans. He can actually trace his lineage to a great grandfather that his father knew his great-grandfather. They were alive, they had overlapping lives, and his great-grandfather was a slave. And, you know, my parents are in their 80s. All my grandparents are gone. And when my parents die, they'll be, in my family, the last living sort of witness to what it was like to be in an internment camp in the United States. And I think about the Cambodian Holocaust, really, and that we have so many of those survivors in our country. Of course, we need ways to connect those young people to their history, and we need to teach that history to Americans too, right? I really decry the kind of nationalism that exists with the current Japanese prime minister. So there's some remnants of the antagonisms among the different ethnic groups, the different Asian ethnicities in our country that kind of get brought here. Some of that is reflected in the misunderstanding of certain recent Chinese immigrant groups that don't understand Japanese American internment, but have hostilities that are very much justified from the way in which the Japanese government has sanitized its history, right? And in the age of fake news and facts that are kind of made up, we have to make sure that that the history that I'm talking about, the history of Cambodian young people, the history of Chinese exclusion, all the stories of how people came to America and why they came to America is all who we are. And to not know that is to not know ourselves. Because knowing that history, you know, I didn't understand this history until after I ran for Congress in 1992, 94. After 2 congressional runs, I realized that I didn't know myself. And I was researching things while I was running for office, running for Congress in 1992 and 94. But you have to understand that what makes a candidate so compelling is their story. The story of who they are, that's not exaggerated, right? You know, Tammy Duckworth, you know, her story, you know, it's like she kind of presents a story just by walking, just by attempting to walk, right? And you know, but deeper than that, the story of her mother, her immigrant mother, and you know, the story of Stephanie Murphy, you know, literally a boat person, right? So to not know those stories and to grow up, I grew up in a very, you know, my brothers and I were probably, along with 1 or 2 other families, the only Asians that went to our high school. But there are places where there are, you know, substantial Asian populations in the schools, communities that are still, they haven't spread out and thinned out in America like some of the Chinese and Japanese American families have done, and the Korean Americans are still very cohesive in communities. That their history needs to be part of their curriculum, and it's part of who they are as Americans, and it's also what engages students. You know, it's much easier to teach a history that starts with your own family, and you learn about the social economic conditions of your grandparents, of your parents, and understand what they have gone through. And I think it does bring an understanding of self. And so that is a very profound thing that I want to see. I want to make sure that we have in our educational system. So of course, my work in Congress will be informed by that kind of sensitivity. But we also have some very practical things that we got to get done. We've got to get comprehensive immigration done. We've got to we've got to have, in my view, nothing will happen without a different administration with a different attitude, a president that is not hostile to immigrants, that does not set a horrible example. So part of the fight, Greg, is joining with Judy Chu and Ted and Grace and Pramila and Achilles Sablan, all of us pushing back hard on when the president started talking about Wuhan virus, or was Wuhan virus or the China virus, and we let him know that it wasn't okay. And I think the pushback was effective. I mean, he called it Kung Flu just a few days ago, right? But we know the harm that this causes young people, that literally puts them in physical danger. And so the struggle in Congress right now is making our colleagues understand that. There was one of my Democratic colleagues was going to go on to a bill that we agreed with probably 95%, 99%, the bill. But what the bill did, it condemns China for the Uyghur camps, it condemns them for a whole host of things. But then the bill was very mean-spirited and said, we call on China to admit that the COVID-19 virus started in China. Like, people didn't know that, but it was all about trying to blame China for the COVID-19 virus and and so we just said, Judy just got on the conference call with the caucus and said, I don't want to see any one of our members of the Democratic caucus get on this bill. And then she just listed all of the people who had been harmed physically, the family that was attacked in Texas, and that member pulled himself off the bill. He was shamed off of that bill. And so I got to tell you, you do have fierce people who we're not going to put up with stuff like that. And none of us should put up with that stuff. I reminded journalists of Vincent Chin in the 80s, what happened to Vincent Chin. For those of you who don't know on the call, Vincent Chin was a Chinese American. He was going to get married. He was engaged to be married. And this was during the 80s when the tensions between the US and Japan were awfully high because of the success of Japanese imported cars. And Detroit was really suffering in terms of job layoffs, and some auto workers at a bar attacked Vincent Chin and killed him brutally and violently. And the judge in the case sentenced them to a very token sentence. It was just a clear disregard for an Asian life. And I said, look, the attacks on China and the association of this virus with a particular racial group, a country of origin, hurts us all. Like I said, in the same way that Vincent Chin wasn't even of Japanese descent. To those auto workers, he was Japanese. It doesn't matter. I mean, it's like to people out there who harbor these hostilities. An Asian face is an Asian face, and it doesn't matter that you're not of a particular ethnicity. So, be assured that you have a KPAC and a KPAC staff that are highly attuned to this. So, all right, I yield back. I'm just sort of rambling now, but you wanted me to tell you what we're up to and what it's like. We're on the watch. We're on the watch for, the excesses of this president, the terrible example he sets. I mean, come on. Kung Flu. The president of the United States kind of acts like a little child, a middle schooler. How much more for those of us who are teachers do we have to deal with students when the president of the United States sets such a terrible example? So a lot of our work is trying to check him to the extent we can. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you so much for sharing those poignant thoughts. I mean, I think they very much are on point. It is truly one of the challenges that we're all facing during this time. I wanted to actually take one of the questions from one of the audience members, Maxine DiMalanta. Appreciate your question. I want to give this one to Rita because I know that OCA and Rita have been very busy in terms of actually addressing this very specific issue of the other aspect of COVID-19 and its impact on teachers and students. But given that social distancing is the new normal, how do you suggest sort of approaching the fact that access to technology is a legitimate barrier for many teachers and students? So Rita, go ahead.
Sure. So with COVID-19, we, OCA actually reached out to a number of colleges, to the NHPIs community specifically. So those minority serving institutions that serve our low income first generation students. And within a day, and we only had a day actually to get answers from them because we were applying for a technology grant. We had 25 campuses out of the almost 200 reply. And what they told us was on those 25 campuses, they knew 4,000 college students who were first generation low income API students who had no computer at home. And so when their campuses closed, they were trying to access their coursework and do their homework on their phones. And a lot of them did not have high-speed internet. And so we really had to scramble where, we were very thankful to our telecom partners. So we reached out to like AT&T, Comcast, Verizon, T-Mobile. We said, what can you offer students and families at this time? So there are resources available to students in K-12 and in college who don't have high-speed internet access. And you can actually go to OCA's website. We have the resources all compiled, actually. There's a little, if you go to our COVID-19 resources, you'll see that there is a section called free and low-cost internet. So we've been working with these corporations to make sure that we have at least some expansion of internet accessibility. The hardware issue is a much more difficult one because especially during this time with libraries closed, a lot of the suppliers and vendors actually, when we were trying to order computers to give to college students, they were running out. And so there is a supply issue right now. I think there could be more funds and incentives given, especially to organizations that may be able to refurbish hardware. And I think, I would highly recommend maybe tax incentives for organizations and companies that can provide hardware to students that are of a certain income level.
Very good. Thanks so much, Rita. Now, our next question from our anonymous attendee, I want to send over to Anna. Specifically, many of us know that what's happening in California, we're approaching a pivotal point in the debate over affirmative action. And as Congressman Takano mentioned, many of us recognize that the Asian American Pacific Islander community have been beneficiaries of affirmative action policies and the recognition that there needs to be diversity in our institutions of higher education. But with ACA 5 in California that's seeking to restore affirmative action, the question has to be asked, sort of where does NCAPA fall in all of this? So the question specifically was, as a second generation Asian American, it is sometimes difficult to explain concepts such as affirmative action to parents in which English isn't their first language. Where can we find translated resources that we can share with our parents? But also, Anna, if you could also answer sort of where the platform and where NCAPA's work has been as it relates to affirmative action.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. As for translated resources, my non-answer of an answer is actually for you to email somebody on NCAPA and, from our wide network of coalition partners, I'm sure we can identify which organization, which staff at which organization could best connect you to in-language resources. I know that at least on CREC's capacity, we serve the Southeast Asian American community, so we may be able to provide support or leads on finding in-language resources for in Vietnamese, in Lao, Khmer, potentially. But that being said, please reach out to us offline and after this panel for additional information on how to find those in-language resources. And as far as where the NCAPA Coalition stands on affirmative action and where the 2020 policy platform stands on affirmative action, NCAP has always, we are very loudly in support of affirmative action and race-conscious admissions for higher education. Congressman Takano remarked on this earlier today, but APIs absolutely do benefit from race-conscious policies and admissions policies that really consider students in their entirety and as their whole selves. And in fact, just considering the incredible diversity of the API community, it's impossible, I think, to really consider a student without thinking about their racial and ethnic background, without their immigration or refugee history. And also just considering how diverse our community is in factors such as socioeconomic status, in terms of whether or not they're first generation students, all of these factors that really influence a young person's application into an institution. For example, Southeast Asian Americans have some of the lowest rates of college attainment, as well as some of the lowest high school graduation rates out of any of the other API, in addition, as well as many Pacific Islander groups as well, in relation to the API average for those areas. And to really say that affirmative action doesn't benefit APIs, I think it hides the fact that we are such a diverse community. It hides the fact that race-conscious policies are really in place to support historically underserved and marginalized communities to achieve educational opportunities. I also want to make a quick additional remark on ACA 5 in California specifically, since Greg did mention it. The constitutional amendment currently being in consideration by the California State Legislature, it's not just an education specific provision as well. It would reinstate affirmative action in higher ed, as well as in small business contracting and in employment. And so really just thinking about how racism has impacted the life trajectories of entire communities, and thinking about how we can begin to amend some of the historical disparities brought on by racism and by discrimination, and to support every person to really thrive and provide opportunity for all. And so I think that's what's at the heart of this issue.
Thanks, Anna. Our next question comes from Alan Wang, who is apparently approaching his 6th year as an API educator. So Alan, thank you for your service. He's asking about the real challenges that many of you have talked about as far as providing support for API students in this COVID-19 environment where a lot of bullying occurred, a lot of anti-Asian racism sort of reared its ugly head. He makes the point that there simply aren't enough API educators there to do this important work. And so Rita, for you, I know one of the things that you all talked about in the platform is how do we support building that pipeline for API teachers? So I'll kick that one over to you.
I think there needs to be more outreach, first of all, done to our community, right, in terms of what it takes to become a teacher, but also having the right mentors in place once they do look at becoming a teacher. So starting actually quite early. I know when I was a student, I certainly didn't think about education and becoming a teacher. I actually went into the technology field straight out of college, and then realized that, I really was more interested in education, and I couldn't find ways, even though I think I was like the ideal candidate at the time. I had graduated from Yale and I was working in the tech sector, but I couldn't figure out an easy path for me to go into teaching. And so it took a lot of soul searching, and it took a lot of talking to other teachers to figure out a way for me to do that. And the barriers were incredibly high. So the certification process in terms of what requirements you have to have in order to become a teacher was actually quite astonishing to me that, for example, with a psychology degree, I still had to take elementary psychology classes to become an elementary teacher. And so it was, there are a lot of hurdles, but I think most importantly, we need the mentorship programs. We need the residency programs starting in high school. So really engaging AAPI students in high school to place them as assistants, in teaching, with a teacher, to really show them, how is it that you do manage a classroom? How do you do lesson plans? And then making sure that we have those programs at the teacher education schools that are targeted towards people of color. So I think that those are some really important steps that would help us have more of us in the classroom.
Thanks, Rita. And Asan, I see you nodding furiously. So I'd love to get your perspective as currently a teacher, how you would respond to some of that in terms of building the pipeline and providing support for perhaps young teachers in your community. Oh, got to unmute yourself again.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, I think that's like one of the most important questions was asked tonight, actually, because I know when I was going to like the teaching profession, I had nobody to turn to. Like Rita said, there's so many requirements, for your major, your minor, and then going to your master's. There's so many processes involved in it. So if imagine if I had someone who was like my mentor when I was right out of high school and, going to college, what they would give me, like, the advices or the steps, it probably cut a lot of like, stress or, relieve some of my stress. And so I think, like if we had like a network of mentors, Asian American, teacher mentors, how amazing would that be, Greg? Like if we have like a list of all our names, and then how we talk about our history and our roots, right? I've met so many students that have told me in California when I did like a national conference over there for LANA, and those kids, it's been like 10 years, and they keep telling me, if you were my teacher, I would work so much harder in school. Is that the same thing with other professions, other teachers? Like, just recently when I was advertising this forum right here, this panel, and then, all these other Lao teachers I was talking to, and, other Asian, American teachers. And they were like, wow, it's amazing to know that you actually were at the same refugee camp in Thailand that I was at. And I go, isn't that amazing? Like I would say, from the hut to the classroom, how did I get here? And, if I were to tell my story, how did I get from scratching on the dirt, in the refugee camp to working the Promethean board or, using my Chromebook? I mean, if you will think about that picture of that one kid, the small kid, 8 years old in the refugee camp, and then here I am teaching in an American school for 25 years. So yes, definitely. I think we need more mentorship. We need more funding that's specifically for, Asian Americans wanting to go into education. Like I had mentioned in our, committee, I don't remember anybody outreaching to me and say, oh, Amazon, you want to be, I see that you have a master's in education administration. Do you want to be a principal, or do you want to go into this area? So I think we need that. We need, organizations like what we do right now with NCAPA, with CIRAC, with LANA, OCA, all of us is going to take the whole community to uplift all of us. Otherwise, it's no good knowing our history. We can't do anything with our history. So that's what I think.
Thank you so much for those true and real comments from the heart. We are just about at time, and as many of you know, as teachers, we have to keep our folks on task. So I'm going to make sure that we finish on time. But to close, one of the questions was, what can we do to educate or move forward into 2021 and beyond? And with this platform, we like to invite all of you, whether you're here in Zoom or watching on Facebook, to take a look at it. Give us your feedback, engage with us, and then take it and use it as a tool as you engage with your elected officials. We hope that this is a roadmap for ways to talk about education policy issues and ways in which decision makers can make improvements for all of our communities. So with that, I'd like to close, but also remind everybody that if you're not, or if you're more interested in more policy conversations, we have another panel in about an hour talking about immigration, which is something we're all familiar with. And then beyond that, on Saturday at 3 p.m. is the AAPI Presidential National Town Hall with Vice President Biden and Governor Eddie Calvo, who's a surrogate for President Trump. We'll have a very similar conversation that dives into real issues that are impacting all of our communities, and we invite all of you to participate there as well. So with that, my honor to close. Thank you again, Congressman Takano. Thank you to our panelists, and to everybody. Have a good night.